All right, so if we look at what is actually moving, okay, so here's our cell at rest, right? We're negative inside, positive outside, because that's what we've learned where the Nernst potential lines up, right? Minus 70 or minus 90, depending on what cell. Okay, so then we have some depolarization that occurs. Well, what tends to happen is the charge is going to tend to move in both directions, right? In other words, it's going to move this way and this way at the same time. And because of this, because one area of membrane triggers a change in the next area of membrane, we get this propagation, we call it, of charge or of membrane change from one place to another. Now, in an action potential, we don't actually want this, right? We want the change to only go in one direction. And the body sort of has a system for that. The inactivation gate of the sodium channel prevents the action potential from spreading in both directions at once, and instead pushes it in only one direction. All right, so let's look at this in 3 segments. Okay, this is our neuron. This is the initial segment. If this segment depolarizes, we'll get an action potential. All right, so let's see how that happens. So in our first step here, we've had enough membrane potential change here from our ligand-gated channels, right, to actually get a high membrane potential. So sodium has now rushed in this area, okay? That sodium doesn't stay put. It's actually attracted to the negativity in the adjacent segment, right? So the positive ions flow towards the next area. That causes the next area to depolarize, causing the sodium channels in the second segment to open. Sodium comes rushing in there, is attracted to the negative, and we get the same thing that happens again. Do you see that? So one area of membrane is depolarizing the other, which is depolarizing the other. Okay, so why doesn't it flow the other way? Because when this when these sodium ions flow in, about this time, these gates become inactive, right? So more sodium can't flow in here. So it drives the action potential away from the area of inactivation and essentially pushes this to happen in only one direction, right? So this axon won't have another action potential until each segment has recovered from the hyperpolarization phase and has restored itself. That's what we mean by refractory period. Where is that? Right here, right? So in the absolute refractory period, this cell cannot have another action potential in that area, right? In the relative refractory period, it's very difficult for it to. So it has a tendency to push the action potential instead of going in both directions. It pushes it in just one direction, which is kind of what we want. Yeah?
I understand how it propagates after one gets started, but in the very beginning when you get a stimulus, like in that previous slide from that, how does it not go both directions from there? Because you have the neuron depolarizing. How do you differentiate which axon it goes down?
Well, each neuron only has one axon.
Okay.
So so like in a local potential, in other words, you've got 10 neurons that are all affecting one area, right? There is some spread in both directions.
Okay.
But when you get to the axon hillock, to the first part, that's when you have these voltage-gated channels that will block it from moving backwards. Good question. All right. So this is continuous propagation. This is old school, right? This is our oldest neurons, like our pain neurons, work in this way. The downside with this system is you've got to move a lot of positive ions around to get this to go from one end to the other. In other words, it's slow, okay? So a trick that the body has developed is how to move the charge without moving the ions, right? Because remember, moving mass takes time. Moving charge is very rapid. It's how we can turn on a light and have the lights come on immediately, because we're not moving anything except the charge. Okay, so when we myelinate an axon, when we take a part of a neuron and we wrap insulation around it, it sets us up for what's called saltatory conduction or leaping conduction. And here, instead of each part of the membrane having to depolarize the next, here we have a bunch of voltage-gated channels, and here we have a bunch, and here we have a bunch. In between, not so many, all right? So what we get is we get a lot of charge that flows in here that then sort of jumps across the membrane until the next node, or the node of Ranvier, which is one of my favorite words, node of Ranvier, is one of these areas where there's lots of voltage-gated channels that allow for very rapid propagation of the action potential from one end to the other, right? So if we sort of look at that in pictures, okay, so here's an area of depolarization, okay, activation gates of sodium are open, so sodium's comes rushing in. The current, instead of activating gates along this path, skip that path and are attracted to the next node, where they then cause depolarization there. Same thing happens to the next node. The charge rushes across the membrane, depolarizes the next node, and so on. So we're saving a ton of time by not having to depolarize all this membrane. Now, the only way that's possible is to have this area of membrane sort of shielded from the outside environment. And the body does that with a fatty substance called myelin, right? So that's these coverings. This is our axon. And surrounding the axon are these sort of fatty, it's almost like electrician's tape. It's wrapped around, and it prevents ions from passing through. So we end up with this insulated area and non-insulated area in that are separated from each other, and we get a very quick and